One of the hardest things that I've learned as a beginner in chess is learning the Rook and Queen Endgame. So today we're going to be going over the Rook and Pawns Endgame, where you have multiple pawns and one rook, to see how you can better convert your endgames into wins. So in this video, I have two examples here, but this first example here is a game between Capablanca and Alexander Alekhine that was played in 1927, and this was their 34th game in that match. And this was the game that actually decided Alekhine's title, in which he held for about 19 years until his death. So in this position here, we have Alekhine as white and Capablanca as black. The one thing that Alekhine has here is they have the passed pawn on a5 with a really well placed rook where they can get it behind the pawn, and black's rook is very passive in this position. So in these kind of positions, it's very important that you stick your rook behind the pawn because it helps defend this pawn as it makes its push, whereas if you had to defend it from the side, it'd be harder to push this pawn because there may be other pieces defending it. So in this position, Alekhine's plan is as follows. Number one is to move this rook behind this pawn. And this is very important because black's rook is going to have to block it here on a6. The second part of Alekhine's idea here is to get the king into the center of the board. By doing this, he'll have better opportunities of defending black's pawn push and also advancing his own pawns. 3, if black decides he wants to keep his king with the pawns here on the king side of the board, bring this king over to attack this rook over here on a6. That's preventing the a5 pawn from moving forward. 4, if the black king decides to leave his pawns and help support the rook on this passed pawn, use your king to attack the pawns on the king side of the board. 5, when the time comes, sacrifice that a pawn so that you can attack the king side pawns and win the game. And 6, once you've attacked the pawns and gotten a good position, push one of your pawns for promotion to a queen. So in this position here, Capablanca has the first moves and he spends it by going a6 here, preventing the advancement of this pawn, and Alekhine responds with a4. And then Capablanca brings his king over to f6, looking to support his rook and possibly the passed pawn, also getting his king to the center of the board. Alekhine does the same with f3. He goes king e5, and then Alekhine keeps opposition. So you have two kings in the center of the board. Alekhine has now accomplished two of his objectives, which is getting this rook behind the pawn here to support it, and then centralizing his king. So now what does Alekhine want to do? He wants to continue his plan, which is to attack the pawns on the king side of the board. After Capablanca goes h5, the king goes d3 here, looking to possibly get in here on c4 and attack this rook and support its passed pawn. Capablanca matches it with king to d5, king to c3, and now we have the king here completely cutting off the white king, and now white can go for attacking the pawns. Alekhine drops the rook back, allowing this king to get in and potentially trade off the rook for the passed pawn, and by that point, white's in a better position to attack the pawns. So what does black want to do? Is he brings the king a little bit closer, and Capablanca decides here that it is in his best interest to eliminate this passed pawn. So Alekhine says, great, I'm going to sidestep you, and I'm going to go for your kingside pawns then. At this point, Capablanca throws the check here, checking this king so you can come here, but 2, getting this king here as a defender. So as Alekhine sidesteps to attack this rook, he throws it in check again, and then as the king moves back, Capablanca is able to stop the advancement of this pawn and is now using this king to stop the pawn advancement. So now the king has to go against the rook and all these pawns. Alekhine responds by going to g5 here, looking to come through here and attack this pawn here. And then Capablanca throws the check here on e5, attacking the king and this pawn. Alekhine responds by going e5 anyways. Alekhine responds by going h5 anyways, looking to penetrate and win this pawn. Rook f5 to defend it, and then Alekhine pushes up here to f4. And the reason he goes f4 is he's planning to go h4 here and bring this king over here to g7, leaving black with no good moves. So black, seeing this, decides to maneuver his rook over here to d5. Alekhine goes ahead and starts to attack this pawn, and Capablanca brings his rook back to d7, guarding this. But the biggest problem is, can black even hold this position? After king to f6 and rook to c7 here, it looks like white's going to have a hard time breaking this pawn chain and winning this game. So Alekhine does what you have to do in this position, which is break up the pawn structure by going here to f5. He takes here, the king takes, and now you're going to be taking this h5 pawn. And that's exactly what happens. Rook comes here to check. The king comes back. The rook's not able to defend both the h5 and f7 pawns. So he goes to protect the f7 pawn here, and Alekhine moves his rook over here to f2. Now this is the key idea in the whole position. In his plan, it was to sack the a pawn here on the queen side so that he can attack the king side pawns and have a pawn majority to win the game. So Capablanca realizes that's the best move is just to take the pawn. He has nothing better in this position. And at this point, Alekhine gets a check, king to b6. He takes the pawn, and now Alekhine is up a pawn here, and one that is a protected passed pawn at this point. King comes to c6. The rook comes to attack this pawn. King comes closer, and Alekhine just takes that last pawn, and even if the rooks were to trade off, you have two passed pawns here on the edge of the board. Alekhine's going to easily win, And that's how he converted his Rook and Pawn endgame in this example. So one thing we learned in this last example is that it's very important to put your rook behind your passed pawns as you push them up the board. By pushing them up, it improves the scope of your rook, one, and decreases the scope of their rook as they defend that pawn, and two, gives your pieces more space as time progresses. And as you do this, you're going to make your pieces more active, which will lead to a better endgame for yourself. In a Rook and Pawn endgame, you really don't want your pieces to be passive. So in this position here, we have black and white. It looks like white has another pass pawn here on the edge of the board. Black is to move, and black starts by going rook to a8 here, looking to stop the advancement of this pass pawn. And then from here, white goes rook to c3 instead of going behind this pawn, and black shoots forward rook to a4, attacking this pawn, but also stopping the advancement of this a3 pawn. What's happened now is white's rook is no longer active in this point. He's going to have to defend this pawn and make it passive. So what that happens is white goes d3 here, protecting both pawns, but now this rook is stuck defending it and it's no longer active. So what black wants to do now is just get this king in the game and get more space. So he brings the king over here to e7, and what black is trying to do is get this king over here to d5 and attack this rook. So white brings his king out, king to e6, king to f3, king to d5, and now he's in this perfect position to attack this rook. This rook is super passive, and white pushes king to e2 here, setting up a subtle trap. The reason being, you're like, oh, rook can just take d4 here, but after that you have king e3, and then when the trade happens, you have opposition with the king, and you have this pass pawn that's going to be really hard for black to deal with. So in this position, after king goes to e2, the best move black makes is just going g5, refusing to fall for the trap and depriving white of any more good moves here. So the rook says, screw it, I will go ahead and relinquish control of this d4 pawn, and trying to get his rook more active in the process. White doesn't take the pawn right away. Instead, he goes f6 here. The reason being, because if the king takes d4 here, the rook can come over here to b7 and attack these kingside pawns, giving white a little better of chances. It still has black at a slight advantage here. So after f6 is played, king to e3 here, defending this pawn, settling himself into a defense position. The biggest problem with white's position here is all four of these pawns are isolated pawns, so they're going to be very easy to pick off once everything starts to crumble. From here, black goes king to c4, attacking this rook and grabbing even more space. There's not a lot of things that white can do here. It's going to get even more passive pretty soon, so he brings his rook back here to d3, defending both pieces. Black pushes up here to d5, which takes away this e4 square from the king. And so now the king is relegated to only going f3 or e2 from here. And so from here, what black is realizing is there's nowhere to really march forward. By pushing here, you're just trading off a pawn. So what he does is he pushes back here to rook to a8, not looking to necessarily go on the king side and attack this pawn because it's defended by the rook, but to get on the b file and start attacking this king. The king realizes this, goes to king 2, trying to stop that idea. Rook to a7 here, and this is a waiting move, looking to get the king back to d2. He can't move over here to b2 because the king just takes with the rook. So once he moves back, then he moves over here to the e file, putting white into his zugzwang. The rook throws the c3 check. Black just takes the pawn here. And the reason that the rook came over here to c3 check instead of moving its king over was if you did move the king over here to c2, you have rook to e2 check, rook to d2, you have the trade, and then you have the king getting the pass pawn here, and he's easily going to pick up the rest of the pawns and easily win the game. So he had to throw the check here. The king just takes the pawn. a4, pushing the pawn up the board. Rook to a7, looking to attack it, and now the rook has to go behind the pawn here on a3, making itself passive once again. The rook comes to a5, blocking that attempt. The kings are in opposition, so what is white going to do? It drops the rook back, and white has no way to advance this pawn, so he's going to shuffle the rook in the meantime. King comes over here to c4. The king then sidesteps, coming to e3, looking to attack its kingside pawns. And black just pushes its d4 pawn forward, bringing the king back to d2. And now black is looking to attack this pawn, letting him push up the side of the board. So the king comes to defend. The king comes to now attack this pawn and potentially blockade it, which would free his rook and lock this rook down in the position. King to e2. And now that the blockaded pawn has happened, the rook has to move to a3 and it's looking to get a little bit more active. But at this point, rook to f4, guarding the d pawn while still attacking other pawns. And after he brings his rook over here to a2, rook to h4, now attacking here. The king now has to sidestep. And the reason he comes over here to d3 is he's looking to attack this pawn, because if he doesn't go to d3, let's say he goes rook to a3, you have king to b4 here, attacking the rook, and you're not able to defend both pawns because you're going to have to move it back and drop this pawn anyways. So after coming h4, the king comes over here to d3. Once the h3 pawn is picked off, the king takes off the pawn in the center of the board. And black throws a check again, king to d3, rook takes, and we're looking to trade off the rooks at this point of the game. If white does take this rook, it's completely lost because it's 3 pawns to 1. And so he moves rook to e2. And now black goes rook to f4, 1 being protected by this pawn and stopping the advancement of this pawn. So now he's just looking to get his king into the game. And white's king comes over here to king to e3 to 1, defend this pawn and give its rook a little bit more activity. So the black king now moves back to b6. Why not to the middle is because after going rook to c8 or c2 here, he's looking to go to c8. And if the king is not in this position, he can't stop it. So then he pushes b7 to stop the idea of the rook getting here to c8. Rook comes over here to c1 as a waiting move. Rook to a4, realizing he can't really do much for f4 and getting his rook more active. Rook to h1, looking to continue this idea on the king side. The king comes over here to c6. And after going to h7, the rook comes over here to a7, defending this pawn. The king comes up later into a4, looking to get into this and attack these pawns. Comes to d6, looking to help defend the pawns. And after going f5 here, you have the tactical shot of g6 here, checking the king. After taking, you trade off the kings, and now you have 2 passed pawns that are easily going to be winning the game. As the king gets here, you have the push pawn here, and you cannot stop the advancement. And black easily wins this game from here. So that is the rook and pawn versus rook versus pawns endgame. The key things to note is to 1, get your rook behind pass pawns to push your pawn up the board, and 2, make sure that you have a more active rook, because an active rook will mean that you have a better rook in the endgame that will pick off any weaknesses that your opponent has. So if you like that video, please like and comment down below. Let me know if this video is helpful anyway. Our next video will be venturing into the queen and pawn endgame. That video will be here, and we'll see you there. Goodbye.